Dr. Jake Morrison sat at his desk on Mars Colony Research Station when the emergency message arrived. The red light on his communication panel blinked rapidly, indicating an urgent transmission from the outer rim. Jake had been studying alien artifacts for 15 years, but nothing had prepared him for what he was about to hear. The message came from Kepler 442b, a mining colony 3 months away by the fastest ships. The voice belonged to Commander Rick Stone, head of mining operations. His voice shook as he spoke into the recording device. Something had been found deep underground, something that should not exist. Jake played the message again. Commander Stone described a massive structure buried beneath the planet's surface. The miners had been digging for rare metals when their equipment hit something hard. At first they thought it was a large rock formation, but when they cleared away the soil, they found smooth black walls covered in strange patterns. The structure was enormous, stretching down into the planet for over a kilometer. It was made of a material they had never seen before, darker than space itself. The patterns on the walls seemed to move when looked at directly, making the miners feel sick and dizzy. But what scared them most was what their scanners revealed inside. There was a single large chamber at the center of the structure. Inside that chamber sat something that looked like a coffin, but it was huge, big enough to hold something much larger than a human. The scanners could not penetrate the material to see what was inside, but they detected strange energy readings coming from within. Jake saved the message and immediately called Dr. Lisa Carter. Lisa worked in the next building, studying alien technology. She was one of the few people who might understand what they were dealing with. Her voice sounded excited when he told her about the discovery. Within an hour, Lisa arrived at his office carrying her portable scanner and a cup of coffee. She was a tall woman with short brown hair and sharp green eyes that missed nothing. Jake played the message for her, watching her expression change from curiosity to concern. The message continued with more disturbing details. The miners had tried to get closer to the structure, but strange things began happening. Several workers reported having vivid nightmares about being buried alive. Others heard voices speaking in languages they did not recognize. The voices seemed to come from inside their own heads rather than from any external source. Work at the mine slowed down as more miners became affected. They reported seeing shadows moving independently of any light source. Some claimed the shadows followed them home to their living quarters. The medical staff found nothing wrong with the affected workers, but recommended they be removed from the dig site. Commander Stone decided to seal off the area around the structure and call for expert help. That was 3 weeks ago. Since then, the situation had become much worse. The last part of Stone's message made Jake's blood run cold. The nightmares had spread to workers who had never been near the dig site. People throughout the colony were experiencing the same visions of being buried alive, of darkness pressing down on them, of something vast and hungry stirring in the depths. The colony's population was 300 people, and nearly all of them were affected. Then came the part that made Lisa drop her coffee cup. Commander Stone's voice became hollow and distant as he described the final development. People were disappearing, not leaving the colony or hiding somewhere, but simply vanishing without any trace. Their quarters showed no signs of struggle. Their personal belongings remained untouched, and the security cameras recorded nothing unusual. The disappearances started with single individuals, then pairs, then entire families. In the span of 1 week, over 50 people had vanished. The remaining colonists were terrified and demanded evacuation, but the next supply ship was not due for 2 months. Jake and Lisa listened to the end of the message in stunned silence. Commander Stone's final words were barely a whisper. He reported that he could hear the voices too now, calling to him from beneath the ground. The patterns on the structure walls were glowing faintly, and the energy readings had increased dramatically. The message ended abruptly with the sound of Stone's chair falling over. There was a moment of static, then silence. Lisa looked at Jake with wide eyes. They both understood the implications. Whatever was buried on Kepler 442b was not just an archaeological curiosity. It was something active, something that could affect human minds across distances, something that could make people disappear without leaving any evidence. Jake immediately contacted Colonel Ben Hughes at Earth Defense Command. Hughes was a career military officer who specialized in first contact protocols and potential alien threats. If anyone could help them understand what they were dealing with, it was him. The colonel's response was swift and direct. He would authorize an immediate expedition to Kepler 442b with full military support. However, he insisted on including Dr. Amy Walsh in the team. Walsh was a quantum physicist who had been studying dimensional anomalies at the edge of known space. Within 2 days, the 4-person team was assembled and boarding the fastest ship available. The journey to Kepler 442b would take 6 weeks using experimental jump drives. Jake spent the trip studying every piece of data about the colony and the mysterious structure. Lisa worked on analyzing the energy signature patterns from Stone's scans. The readings were unlike anything in their databases, showing characteristics that seemed to violate known physics. Colonel Hughes reviewed security protocols and prepared contingency plans for various scenarios. Dr. Walsh focused on the dimensional aspects of the discovery. Her preliminary analysis suggested that the structure might exist partially outside normal spacetime, which would explain why scanners had difficulty penetrating it. As their ship approached Kepler 442b, they received no response to their communication attempts. The colony was completely silent, its communication array still functioning but no one answering their calls. Long-range sensors showed that the colony's power grid was still operational and life support systems were running normally. But there were no life signs anywhere on the planet surface. Jake stared out at the red planet growing, larger in their view screen. Somewhere beneath that barren surface lay something that had consumed an entire colony of 300 people without leaving a trace, something that could reach into human minds and drive them to madness or worse. He wondered if they were making a terrible mistake by coming here, but scientific curiosity drove him forward. Humanity had always pushed into the unknown, always sought to understand what others feared to examine. This time, that curiosity might be leading them into something far more dangerous than they could possibly imagine. Their ship landed on Kepler 442b 3 hours after dawn. The planet's red sun cast long shadows across the empty mining colony as Jake Morrison and his team stepped onto the surface. The silence was complete except for the gentle hum of life, support systems continuing their automated cycles in buildings where no one remained to need them. Colonel Ben Hughes led them through the deserted streets with his weapon ready, though he knew bullets would be useless against whatever had taken 300 people without a fight. Dr. Lisa Carter carried her scanner, which beeped steadily as it detected the same strange energy readings that had appeared in Commander Stone's final reports. The colony looked perfectly normal at first glance. Doors were closed but not locked. Vehicles sat parked in neat rows, and the cafeteria still had food sitting on tables as if people had simply stepped away for a moment. But Jake noticed the details that made his skin crawl. Every door in the colony stood slightly open, just a crack, as if people had started to leave but changed their minds. Personal belongings were scattered in small piles throughout the buildings, not thrown around in panic but carefully arranged in patterns that hurt to look at directly. Dr. Amy Walsh held her dimensional scanner up to one of these arrangements. The device nearly overloaded as it detected space that was folded in on itself, creating pockets where the inside was larger than the outside. She showed the readings to the others, her voice barely steady as she explained what they meant. The missing colonists had not simply vanished. They had been pulled into spaces that existed between normal dimensions, spaces that could be accessed from anywhere in the colony, but led to somewhere else entirely. The energy required for such manipulation was beyond anything human science had achieved. Lisa's equipment detected the strongest readings coming from the mining site on the edge of the colony. They loaded their gear into one of the abandoned mining vehicles and drove toward the excavation. The road was smooth and well-maintained, but Jake noticed that all the plants along the route had turned black. Their leaves and stems withered as if drained of life itself. The mining site was a massive open pit with equipment still running on automatic cycles. Giant machines continued their programmed tasks of moving earth and sorting materials, operated by computer systems that did not know their human supervisors were gone. The sound of machinery working without purpose created an eerie backdrop as the team approached the center of the excavation. The structure that the miners had uncovered rose from the bottom of the pit like a black mountain. Its surface was so dark it seemed to absorb light, making it difficult to judge distances or see details clearly. The patterns covering its walls moved constantly, shifting and changing in ways that made everyone feel dizzy when they looked too long. Colonel Hughes set up a secure perimeter, while the scientists began their investigation. His military training had taught him to expect ambushes and direct attacks, but this situation was unlike anything in his experience. The enemy was invisible, could strike anywhere, and had already proven it could eliminate an entire settlement without leaving evidence of violence. Jake and Lisa descended into the pit using mining equipment. The structure was even more impressive up close, its walls rising nearly straight up for hundreds of meters before disappearing into darkness above. The geometric patterns were carved deep into the surface, and Jake could swear they were moving faster when he was not looking directly at them. Their scanners began malfunctioning as they approached the base of the structure. The readings became erratic, showing impossible measurements that violated basic physics. Lisa's equipment detected temperatures that were simultaneously burning hot and freezing cold in the same location. Dr. Walsh called down to them from the rim of the pit. Her dimensional scanner was showing massive distortions in space-time around the structure. The readings suggested that the interior of the building existed in folded space, making it much larger inside than its external dimensions would allow. The entrance to the structure was a simple rectangular opening at ground level, with no door or barrier of any kind. Jake shone his flashlight into the opening, but the beam seemed to be absorbed by the darkness within. He could see perhaps 10 meters before the light simply stopped, as if hitting a wall of shadow. Lisa attached a cable to Jake's safety harness and followed him into the structure. The moment they crossed the threshold, their radio contact with the others became filled with static. But mixed in with the electronic noise were other sounds that made no sense. Voices speaking in languages that seemed to bypass their ears and speak directly to their minds. The interior walls were covered with the same moving patterns, but here they glowed with a faint light that provided just enough illumination to see. The corridor stretched ahead of them far longer than the structure's external size should have allowed. Jake's distance meter showed they had walked over a kilometer, but when he looked back, the entrance was still visible just a few dozen meters behind them. The air inside the structure felt thick and heavy, like breathing through water. Both scientists found themselves moving slower and thinking less clearly the deeper they went. Lisa's scanner detected increasing levels of the strange energy that had been affecting the colonists, but now it was concentrated enough to cause physical symptoms. They began hearing footsteps echoing from passages they had not entered. The sounds seemed to come from behind walls, above their heads, and sometimes from directions that should not exist in three-dimensional space. Jake called out, hoping to find survivors, but his voice was absorbed by the darkness without even an echo. The corridor branched into multiple paths, but Jake's compass spun wildly, unable to determine direction. They chose the path that seemed to glow slightly brighter, and continued deeper into the structure. The walls here were covered with new types of patterns, designs that seemed to show star maps and astronomical charts, but for constellations that did not match any known sky. After what felt like hours but measured as only 20 minutes on their chronometers, they reached the central chamber. It was a vast circular room with a domed ceiling that disappeared into darkness above. In the center of the room sat the object that had appeared on the miners' scanners. The coffin was enormous, easily large enough to hold something 3 times the size of a human. It was made of the same black material as the walls, but its surface was perfectly smooth except for intricate carvings around the edges. The patterns on the coffin were different from those on the walls, more complex and somehow more urgent in their movement. Jake and Lisa approached the coffin carefully, their scanners detecting massive energy levels radiating from within. The readings were so intense that their equipment began shutting down to prevent damage, but they could see enough to confirm what the miners had discovered. At the head of the coffin was a small circular opening, just large enough to insert a camera probe. The opening was perfectly round and smooth, as if it had been designed specifically for observation. Around the opening were symbols that neither scientist recognized, but they seemed to pulse with meaning just beyond understanding. Lisa suggested they return to the surface to get Dr. Walsh and Colonel Hughes before proceeding. The dimensional distortions and energy readings were beyond anything they had encountered, and they needed the full team to decide how to investigate safely. As they turned to leave, Jake noticed something that made his blood freeze. Carved into the wall beside the coffin were symbols that looked familiar. They were not alien writing, but human letters, roughly scratched into the hard surface as if done with fingernails or primitive tools. The message was simple but terrifying in its implications. It read, "Don't look inside" in English, followed by what appeared to be Commander Stone's signature. Jake Morrison stared at Commander Stone's carved warning until Lisa Carter grabbed his arm and pulled him away from the coffin. They moved quickly through the twisting corridors, their flashlights cutting weak beams through darkness that seemed alive and hungry. The return journey felt different, as if the structure itself was watching their retreat with interest rather than concern. When they emerged from the entrance, Colonel Hughes and Dr. Walsh were waiting with worried expressions. The radio static had grown worse while Jake and Lisa were inside, and both surface team members reported hearing voices in the interference. The voices spoke in perfect English, calling their names and asking them to come down into the structure. Lisa immediately began analyzing the readings she had taken near the coffin. The energy signatures were unlike anything in their databases, showing patterns that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Dr. Walsh confirmed that the space-time distortions around the structure were growing stronger, affecting an area that now extended several kilometers beyond the mining site. Colonel Hughes established a secure communication link with their orbiting ship and requested immediate backup. However, the response from their ship's captain was disturbing. The crew had been experiencing the same nightmares that had plagued the colonists. Dreams of being buried alive and of something vast stirring in cosmic darkness. Jake described the carved warning they had found, but even as he spoke, he felt a growing compulsion to return to the central chamber. The rational part of his mind recognized this as the same influence that had affected the miners. But knowing about it did not make the feeling any less powerful. Dr. Walsh suggested they establish a base camp at the mining site and use remote equipment to investigate the coffin. Her dimensional scanners had detected quantum entanglement signatures around the small opening, suggesting that whatever was inside existed in a state of superposition, simultaneously here and not here until observed. They spent the rest of the day setting up monitoring equipment around the structure. Every piece of technology they deployed began showing anomalous readings within hours. Cameras recorded shadows moving independently of any light source. Audio equipment picked up whispers in languages that linguistic analysis could not identify, and radiation detectors measured energy types that should not exist. That night, the team made camp in the colony's communications center, hoping the building's shielding would protect them from whatever influence was emanating from the structure. But sleep brought no relief from the growing pressure in their minds. Jake's dreams were filled with visions of vast spaces between stars, where something immense drifted through cosmic emptiness. The thing in his dreams was not evil in any way humans could understand, but its very existence was antithetical to life as they knew it. It consumed consciousness itself, feeding on the thoughts and memories of entire civilizations. Lisa dreamed of mathematical equations that described the folding of space-time around objects of infinite density and zero volume. The mathematics were beyond current human understanding, but in her dream state, she grasped concepts that would revolutionize physics if she could remember them clearly upon waking. Colonel Hughes found himself reliving battles that had never happened, conflicts where human soldiers fought entities that existed partially outside normal reality. In these visions, conventional weapons were useless and victory came only through sacrifice and determination that bordered on madness. Dr. Walsh experienced the most disturbing dreams of all. She saw herself standing in the central chamber, looking down at the coffin's opening while something looked back up at her. The thing inside was not contained by the coffin, but was using it as a window, a way to observe the universe it planned to consume. They woke before dawn, all reporting similar experiences. The dreams had been too vivid and consistent to be normal sleep phenomena. Something was actively communicating with them, sharing visions and knowledge that they were not meant to possess. Jake made the decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Despite the obvious dangers and the warning carved by Commander Stone, they had to know what was inside the coffin. The entity was already affecting them from a distance, and understanding its nature might be their only chance of finding a way to contain or destroy it. Dr. Walsh prepared a quantum-entangled camera system that could transmit in real time, without physical connection to their monitoring equipment. The camera was small enough to fit through the opening in the coffin, and advanced enough to function in the dimensional distortions they had measured. Colonel Hughes objected strongly, citing safety protocols and the obvious influence the entity was having on their judgment. But he was overruled by the unanimous decision of the three scientists, all of whom felt the same compulsion to look inside the coffin. They returned to the central chamber as a group, carrying the camera equipment and additional recording devices. The structure seemed different in daylight, its walls pulsing with patterns that were more complex and urgent than before. The whispers in their minds had become clearer, speaking words in English that made terrible sense. The voices told them that curiosity was humanity's greatest strength and weakness. They praised human determination to seek knowledge regardless of consequences. They promised that looking inside the coffin would answer questions about the nature of existence itself. Jake positioned the camera at the opening while Lisa monitored the quantum entanglement readings. Dr. Walsh tracked dimensional fluctuations, and Colonel Hughes maintained security, though they all knew his weapons would be useless against whatever they were about to encounter. The camera descended into the coffin's interior, its quantum signal transmitting images back to their monitoring screens. At first they saw only darkness, but as the camera adjusted its sensors, shapes began to emerge in the black void within. The coffin was much larger inside than outside, its interior stretching away into impossible distances. But it was not empty. Floating in the darkness were shapes that looked like people, hundreds of them, suspended in what appeared to be some kind of energy field. Jake recognized some of the faces from colony identification records. These were the missing miners and colonists, but something was wrong with them. Their bodies moved in ways that defied human anatomy, limbs bending at angles that should have broken bones, heads turning in complete circles without apparent discomfort. As the camera moved deeper into the space, more details became visible. The suspended figures were not dead, but not truly alive either. Their eyes were open but completely black, reflecting no light. Their mouths moved constantly, speaking words that the camera's audio systems recorded, but that made no sense in any human language. Dr. Walsh's readings showed that the space inside the coffin existed in folded dimensions, creating a prison that was larger inside than outside but still completely sealed. The energy field holding the human figures was composed of quantum-entangled consciousness, their minds linked together in a network that spanned multiple dimensions. But the most terrifying discovery came when the camera reached the center of the space. There, surrounded by the suspended colonists, was something that hurt to look at even through electronic transmission. It was darkness given form, a void shaped like a creature but consisting of empty space between stars. The entity became aware of their observation the moment the camera focused on it. Jake felt its attention turned toward them like the weight of a collapsing star, pressing down on his consciousness with force that threatened to crush his sanity. The thing in the coffin was not imprisoned by the structure but was using it as a base, a place to gather the consciousness it consumed, while it prepared for something much larger. Through the quantum entanglement link, the entity began to communicate directly with their minds. It showed them visions of its origin in the space between galaxies, where it had drifted for billions of years, consuming entire civilizations. It had come to their galaxy following signals transmitted by spacefaring species, drawn by the taste of consciousness that reached across cosmic distances. The ancient civilization that had built the structure had not trapped the entity, but had made a bargain with it. In exchange for being allowed to exist, they would provide it with a steady supply of conscious beings to consume. The coffin was not a prison but a feeding chamber, and the missing colonists were just the latest meal. But the entity had grown tired of the limited offerings provided by the ancient builders. It wanted to feed on an entire species, and humanity's rapid expansion across the galaxy had caught its attention. The mining operation on Kepler 442b had been no accident, but had been guided by subtle influences that led humans directly to the feeding chamber. As this terrible knowledge flooded their minds, Jake realized they had made a catastrophic mistake. By observing the entity through the quantum camera, they had created a permanent link between it and human space. The creature could now influence events across light years of distance, drawing more humans to feeding sites while it prepared for its greatest feast. The entity's hunger was infinite, and Earth's 8 billion people would barely satisfy its appetite for a single day. The quantum camera continued transmitting images from inside the coffin, as Jake Morrison and his team struggled to comprehend what they were seeing. The entity's communication filled their minds with visions that spanned millions of years and countless worlds. Through these overwhelming glimpses, they began to understand the true scope of what humanity faced. The creature showed them memories of the first civilization it had encountered. They had been peaceful explorers, much like humans, curious about the universe beyond their home system. Their first deep space probe had detected unusual energy signatures in the void between galaxies, signatures that matched the readings Dr. Walsh was now recording on Kepler 442b. Like humans, they had investigated. Like humans, they had been consumed. The entity fed on consciousness in ways that transcended simple death. It absorbed not just individual minds but entire cultures, taking their knowledge, their history, their dreams and fears. Each civilization it consumed made it stronger and more intelligent, adding their technological achievements to its ever-growing capabilities. The ancient builders of the structure had been its third victim. They had possessed technology far beyond current human science, including the ability to manipulate space-time and create pocket dimensions. But even their advanced knowledge had not been enough to destroy the entity, only to delay it. Dr. Lisa Carter monitored the quantum entanglement readings as the entity continued its mental assault. The connection between their observation equipment and the creature was growing stronger with each passing moment. Through this link, it was learning about human technology, human psychology, and most importantly, the location of every human colony in the galaxy. Colonel Ben Hughes tried repeatedly to contact their orbiting ship, but the communication channels were now filled with voices speaking in the languages of extinct civilizations. The entity was using their quantum link to broadcast across human space, sending subtle influences that would draw more ships to Kepler 442b. The creature revealed its long-term strategy through fragmented visions. It had been patient for millions of years, allowing spacefaring species to develop and spread across multiple worlds before revealing itself. A single planet could feed it for days, but a galactic civilization could sustain it for centuries. Humanity's rapid expansion and curious nature made them perfect prey. The entity had already begun influencing human exploration, subtly guiding survey teams toward worlds where it had placed feeding stations. Kepler 442b was just one of dozens of such worlds scattered throughout human space. Dr. Walsh's dimensional scanners detected massive fluctuations in the space-time around the structure. The entity was drawing energy from the quantum entanglement link, using their observation to power some kind of transformation. The reading suggested it was preparing to emerge from its dimensional prison. Through the camera feed, they watched as the creature began to change shape. The darkness that formed its body started expanding, growing larger and more complex. The suspended colonists around it began moving faster, their black eyes glowing with increasing intensity as their consciousness was consumed to fuel the entity's emergence. Jake realized they had to destroy the quantum link before the creature could use it to escape or to send more influences across human space. But when he reached for the camera controls, he found himself unable to move. The entity was now strong enough to directly control their actions through the quantum connection. Lisa tried to shut down the entanglement equipment, but her hands refused to obey her commands. The creature was keeping them connected, using their continued observation to power its transformation, while preventing them from breaking the link that fed it. Colonel Hughes was the only one still able to move freely, his military training helping him resist the entity's mental influence. He drew his weapon and aimed it at the camera equipment, but before he could fire, the entity showed him visions that froze him in place. The creature revealed what would happen to Earth if they destroyed the camera now. Breaking the quantum link would not stop the entity's escape, but would simply redirect its attention to other human settlements. It already knew the location of dozens of colonies, and without the team's continued observation, they would have no way to track its movements. The entity offered them a choice through direct mental communication. They could continue observing, allowing it to slowly drain their consciousness while keeping it contained to Kepler 442b, or they could break the link and watch helplessly as it consumed every human settlement in the galaxy one by one. But there was a third option, one the creature revealed with what might have been amusement. The ancient civilization that had built the structure had tried to turn it into a weapon rather than just a feeding station. They had attempted to reverse the flow of consciousness, making the entity consume itself instead of external sources. The builders had failed because they lacked the will to see the process through to completion. The transformation required conscious beings to maintain the quantum links, while the structure consumed their minds to power the reversal process. The ancient builders had withdrawn their volunteers when the process became too painful, allowing the entity to break free and consume their entire civilization. Dr. Walsh understood the implications immediately. The structure could be turned into a weapon capable of destroying the entity, but only if people were willing to sacrifice themselves to power the process. The quantum entanglement links that fed the creature could be reversed, but someone had to maintain the connection while their consciousness was being consumed. Jake felt a surge of hope mixed with terror. Humanity had always been willing to sacrifice for the greater good, but this would require volunteers to literally give up their minds and souls. The process would not just kill them, but would erase them from existence entirely, their consciousness used as fuel for the entity's destruction. The creature seemed to read his thoughts and responded with visions of humanity's history. It showed him every war, every sacrifice, every moment when humans had chosen to die rather than surrender. But it also showed him the limits of human endurance, the points at which even the strongest wills had broken under pressure. The entity was confident that humans would fail, just as the ancient builders had failed. It had observed their species through stolen memories from the colonists and believed it understood human psychology. Humans were individually weak, prone to panic and selfish behavior when faced with extinction. But the entity had misunderstood something fundamental about human nature. Jake felt this realization growing in his mind as he watched the creature's preparations for emergence. The entity had studied humans as individuals, but had never encountered their collective strength, their ability to unite against impossible odds. Through the quantum link, Jake began broadcasting a message to every human settlement in the galaxy. He bypassed normal communication channels and transmitted directly through the entanglement network the entity had created. His message was simple but carried the full weight of humanity's determination. The entity was real. It was coming for them and they were going to stop it. The response from human space was immediate and overwhelming. Instead of panic and retreat, colonies throughout the galaxy began volunteering for suicide missions. Scientists offered to develop technologies they knew would kill them. Soldiers volunteered for battles they could not win, and entire populations prepared to sacrifice themselves to save others. Dr. Carter began working on modifications to the structure's quantum systems, using knowledge gained from the entity's own communications. Dr. Walsh calculated the energy requirements for reversing the consciousness flow, determining exactly how many human minds would need to be consumed to power the weapon. Colonel Hughes coordinated with military commanders across human space, organizing volunteers and resources for the most desperate battle in human history. They had perhaps weeks before the entity completed its emergence, weeks to turn humanity's greatest weakness into its greatest weapon. The creature watched these preparations through the quantum link, its confidence beginning to waver for the first time in millions of years. It had never encountered a species willing to destroy itself completely, to deny a predator its meal. Humanity was proving to be unlike any civilization it had previously consumed, but the entity was ancient and patient. It began its own counter-preparations, drawing on the knowledge of every civilization it had destroyed. If humans wanted to make this a battle of wills, it would show them the futility of resistance against cosmic forces beyond their comprehension. The next 2 weeks transformed human civilization in ways that no war or discovery had ever achieved. News of the cosmic entity spread through quantum communication networks faster than any government could contain it. Instead of causing panic, the revelation united humanity in a way that seemed impossible just days before. Jake Morrison watched from the central chamber as ships from every human colony converged on Kepler 442b. The entity observed through their quantum link, studying these new arrivals with growing confusion. It had expected humans to flee or fight among themselves when faced with extinction. Instead, they were arriving in waves, each ship carrying volunteers who knew they would never return home. Dr. Lisa Carter had spent sleepless days working with scientists across human space to modify the ancient structure. Using the entity's own communications, they had learned to reverse the quantum entanglement systems that powered the feeding chamber. The process was incredibly complex, requiring precise calibration of dimensional frequencies while maintaining stable connections to dozens of conscious minds. The modifications were dangerous beyond any human undertaking in history. Each volunteer who connected to the system would have their consciousness slowly consumed to power the weapon, but they had to remain mentally coherent long enough to guide the process. It was not a quick death, but a gradual erasure of everything that made them human. Colonel Ben Hughes coordinated the arriving volunteers from a command center established in the mining colony. The diversity of people willing to sacrifice themselves amazed even his military perspective. They came from every human world, every profession, every age group above legal adulthood, scientists and farmers, soldiers and artists, all united by the determination to deny the entity its cosmic feast. Dr. Amy Walsh had calculated that destroying the creature would require the conscious sacrifice of at least 200 people. Their minds consumed over a period of several hours to generate enough energy for the reversal process. But over 3,000 volunteers had already arrived on Kepler 442b, with more ships arriving daily. The entity watched these preparations with increasing agitation. Through its link with Jake's team, it could observe human civilization responding to the threat in ways that defied its understanding. Every previous species it had encountered had fragmented under pressure, with individuals seeking personal survival over collective good. But humans were different. The entity's attempts to spread fear and despair through its quantum broadcasts were having the opposite effect. Each message meant to demoralize them instead strengthened their resolve. Reports of the creature's past victims only increased the number of volunteers, willing to die to prevent more civilizations from suffering the same fate. The entity began using more direct methods to break human will. It showed volunteers visions of what the consciousness consumption process would feel like. The gradual dissolution of identity and memory as their minds were converted to energy. It displayed memories of other species that had tried and failed to resist, emphasizing the futility of struggle against cosmic forces. These psychological attacks backfired spectacularly. Humans who saw the suffering of previous victims became more determined to prevent future atrocities. The entity's demonstrations of power only reinforced their conviction that it had to be stopped regardless of cost. Jake felt the creature's growing desperation through their mental link. For the first time in millions of years, it was facing a species that genuinely did not care about individual survival when the stakes were high enough. The entity had built its entire strategy around the assumption that conscious beings would choose personal existence over abstract principles. Dr. Carter completed the modifications to the structure 3 days before the entity was scheduled to complete its emergence. The ancient quantum systems had been reversed and amplified, creating a weapon that could consume the creature's consciousness. Using the same mechanisms it employed to feed on others, the process required volunteers to be connected directly to the structure through neural interfaces, their minds becoming part of the weapon's targeting system. Each volunteer would experience the entity's consumption from the inside, guiding the reversal process while their own consciousness was slowly destroyed. The first group of volunteers consisted of Jake's original team plus 50 others chosen for their technical expertise and mental stability. They knew they were essentially committing elaborate suicide, but their determination never wavered. Dr. Walsh made final calculations while Lisa supervised the neural interface installations. Colonel Hughes maintained communication with human space as the process began. Military commanders reported that civilian populations throughout the galaxy were preparing for the possibility that the weapon might fail. If the entity survived and began its galactic feeding frenzy, humanity was ready to make its extinction as expensive as possible for their cosmic predator. The volunteers entered the modified quantum chamber in shifts, their neural interfaces connecting them directly to the structure's consciousness manipulation systems. Jake was among the first, feeling the entity's attention focus on him as his mind became part of the weapon's guidance system. Creature attempted to corrupt the weapon by flooding the volunteers' consciousness with visions of cosmic horror and existential despair. It showed them the heat death of the universe, the ultimate meaninglessness of all conscious existence, the futility of resistance against entropy itself. But humanity had always found meaning in defiance of cosmic indifference. The volunteers absorbed the entity's psychological attacks and used them as fuel for their determination. Each vision of universal meaninglessness only reinforced their conviction that conscious beings had to create their own purpose through action and sacrifice. The reversal process began slowly, the modified quantum systems drawing power from the volunteer's consciousness to create an inverse feeding field around the entity. The creature found itself experiencing hunger for the first time in its existence, a desperate need for mental energy that its own nature prevented it from satisfying. As more volunteers connected to the weapon system, the entity's struggles became more violent. It attempted to break free from the structure by consuming the remaining colonists it held in suspension. But the reversed quantum field turned its own feeding mechanisms against it. Dr. Walsh monitored the process from her console, watching as the entity's dimensional prison became its destroyer. The creature that had consumed countless civilizations was being dissolved by the same forces it had used to feed. Its consciousness converted to energy and dissipated across multiple dimensions. The entity made one final attempt to preserve itself by offering Jake and the other volunteers a bargain. It promised to leave human space and seek prey elsewhere in the galaxy, to spare Earth and its colonies in exchange for its freedom. The offer was broadcast through the quantum link to every human settlement, giving their entire species the chance to accept mercy from their cosmic predator. The response from humanity was unanimous and immediate. Every human colony, every ship, every individual with access to communication networks sent the same message. They would accept no bargains with a creature that had committed genocide against entire civilizations. The entity would be destroyed completely, regardless of what it offered or threatened. This collective rejection of compromise finally broke the entity's confidence completely. It had never encountered a species that would choose extinction over submission to superior force. Even facing certain destruction, humans refused to allow their predator to escape and consume others. The reversal process accelerated as the entity's struggles weakened the dimensional barriers containing it. Jake felt his consciousness being consumed by the weapon systems, but he also felt the creature's terror as it experienced powerlessness for the first time since its creation in the void between galaxies. As Jake's individual awareness faded, he became part of something larger. The minds of all the volunteers merged through the quantum link, creating a collective consciousness powerful enough to guide the entity's complete destruction. In their final moments, they experienced the satisfaction of knowing their sacrifice would save countless future civilizations. The entity's last coherent thought was a grudging respect for the species that had destroyed it. Humanity had proven that conscious beings could transcend their individual limitations through collective will and shared purpose. It was a lesson that came too late for the creature, but would echo through the quantum dimensions long after both predator and prey were gone. The weapon completed its work 6 hours after the process began. The entity that had consumed civilizations across multiple galaxies was reduced to quantum static and dissipated harmlessly into empty space. The structure that had housed it collapsed into normal three-dimensional space, leaving only a crater where humanity had made its greatest stand. The volunteers who powered the weapon were gone completely, their consciousness consumed in the process of destroying their cosmic enemy. But their sacrifice had saved not just humanity, but every intelligent species that would ever evolve in their galaxy. Humanity continued its expansion into space with new knowledge of the dangers that lurked between the stars.